Okay, I think we are now live. Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Fulton and I'm Executive Director with the Scottish Maritime Cluster. I'm delighted to welcome you all this morning to the Scottish Maritime Cluster's first workshop on net zero carbon. Before I go over today's agenda, I have a bit of housekeeping to take you through while everyone is joining the call. We're recording today's session, so there'll be no need to scribble down notes as we go. The recording will be made available to all delegates after the session is finished. There will be an opportunity to ask questions throughout the event, and indeed, please do. We'd like to hear from as many of you as possible, as your feedback today will drive the agenda for our follow-up workshops. So to ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. My colleague, Duncan Cunningham, who you will see on the screen, will be collating these questions to put to our panel in the panel discussion towards the end of the event. We'll be keeping the questions anonymous, but please do say who you are, where you're from, in case you don't get a response. And we'll try to get a response to you after the meeting. We won't be able to respond to you if you use the anonymous button. The session is being moderated behind the scenes by our friends at Brodie's, who've allowed us to use their platform to host this event, and our thanks go to them. If you encounter any technical issues, please use the chat button at the bottom of the screen and somebody will help you there. That's the chat button for technical issues and the Q&A button for questions to the panel. We'll be running one poll during the event. To access this poll, you'll need to be using the Zoom app, which the majority of you will be doing. The poll, unfortunately, will not work if you're accessing the event from your browser. Thank you to Brodie's, Scotland's largest law firm, for hosting this webinar today on behalf of the Scottish Maritime Cluster. Brodie's provides a full range of legal services to businesses and organisations and includes a team that specialises in advice for the maritime sector. Once again, our thanks to Brodie's. Now on to today's agenda. In a moment, I'll hand over to Douglas Lang, Chairman of the Scottish Maritime Cluster, to say a few words about the cluster and our commitment to net zero. I'm delighted to say that we'll then be joined by the Minister for Energy, Connectivity and the Islands, Mr. Paul Wheelhouse, who will deliver our keynote speech. Mr. Wheelhouse will be leaving us at 10:30, but there should be time for a few questions, so please do ask your questions through the Q&A button. A warm welcome to you, Minister. We'll then hear from Kevin Hobbs and Declan MacDonald from Caledonian Maritime Assets Limited to talk about future alternative fuels. Kevin is also one of the directors of the Scottish Maritime Cluster. Welcome, Kevin and Declan. We have Neil Kermode from the European Marine Energy Centre, who will be telling us about some of the great things that are happening up in Orkney. Welcome, Neil. Next up, we will have Ben Murray, Director with Maritime UK, and Ben will be talking about some of the things that Maritime UK have been doing to support the maritime sector to achieve net zero, especially around the UK government spending review. Welcome, Ben. We'll hear from Graeme McKinley from Babcock LGE, who will be talking about technology enabling transition to net zero. Welcome, Graeme. And last but certainly not least, Richard Westgarth from cluster members BMT Group, here with his MarRI-UK hat on to tell us more about MarRI-UK and especially their flagship project on zero carbon coastal highway. So a warm welcome to you, Richard. So as I said previously, please submit your questions throughout the event. Feedback to myself at brian.fulton at scottishmaritimecluster.com or duncan.cunningham at scottishmaritimecluster.com with your thoughts on the event and subject matter for future events. I'd now like to hand over to Douglas Lang, Chairman of the Scottish Maritime Cluster.
Yeah, good morning to you all and a special welcome to Mr. Paul Wheelhouse. His attendance here this morning is especially welcome and relevant since whilst the members of the Scottish Maritime Cluster are, as the name suggests, interested in things maritime, the subject for today's webinar is energy, but more specifically, clean energy. The world has decided that carbon emissions, as well as other greenhouse gases, are no longer something we can accept. So we are all embarked on a journey to find alternative fuels to power our trade. Unfortunately, the timescale for maritime is extremely short. Over the last 20 years or so, there has been a lot of discussion. My God, an awful lot of discussion and not a huge amount of action. Maritime has a drop dead date of 2050, but that can't mean business as usual until 2049, and it'll be all right on the night. The expectation is that we are already on a trajectory to our goal, and that trajectory should be convex, not concave. By 2030, carbon emissions will be 50% lower than in 2008, which means our discussions today have to at least comply with that requirement. With over 150 years of internal combustion engine, development powered by oil and maritime world today is almost 100% reliant on the two, and the solution has served us well. Solving the net zero challenge offers a multitude of challenges and a multitude of potential solutions. Most current solutions are evolutionary, but some proposals are revolutionary. Some are intermediate, some solve one part of the equation, but cause other unpleasant side effects. Some will use existing supply chains, some will need complete new infrastructure. Some will reduce the carrying capacity of vessels and thereby increase the total amount of tonnage required, which is an overall negative effect on emissions. Some will work on existing internal combustion cycles, some will need whole new power units. Previously, I've suggested that maritime is an industry skilled in adapting and adopting new technology. Our history is not one of where we have been the primary developers of new technology. And that is important. Why? The Scottish Maritime Cluster is not about maritime companies huddling together to find solace. The cluster is about awakening and unleashing the latent power of all sectors who can and should be looking at the potential of maritime as a market. Again, you'll have heard me and other members of the board talk about our role in knocking down silos and facilitating the joining of dots. We are a catalytic organ and our membership is open to all who have an interest and contribution to maritime. The cluster has a clear vision of what it wants to achieve in growing the GVA of Scottish maritime interests. And while we remain focused on that, we cooperate and mutually support other industry bodies whose expertise in government and legislative affairs at local, national, and international level is extremely useful to us. The cluster started with a group of enthusiasts who recognize a need. 3 years on, we have a membership of nearly 40 and executive support putting our ambitions into play, but none of this would have been possible without support of Scottish enterprise. Their financial support has been important, but much more than that, we have developed and can continue to develop a relationship where they can introduce services and companies to us, and similarly, we can ask them about potential developments in other sectors. They have also attended all of our workshops and explained how they can assist industry, something that isn't always widely appreciated. Our cooperation is a good example of what can be achieved by joining a couple of dots. Finally, the opportunities for countries, companies, and individuals with vision to contribute to net zero emissions is enormous. Similarly, the flip side of getting it wrong could be disastrous. If only it was a choice between VHS and Betamax for those of this generation, life would be simple, but the complexity of the solutions required for the world to reach net zero are immense, and I believe the potential for solutions coming from members of the cluster is also immense. And on that note, I'll sit back and look forward to today's presentations and hand you back to our moderator, Brian.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Douglas. I'm now delighted to welcome the Minister for Energy, Connectivity and the Islands, Mr. Paul Wheelhouse. Welcome to you, Minister.
Hi there. Sorry, I hope you can hear me. We're just having a few IT problems here, but if you bear with me.
No problem. There we go. We can see you now.
Everything's gone a bit crazy on my computer since I joined, so apologies for any issues while I'm just trying to sort myself out. I think that's hopefully going to be me in a minute. Do you need me to speak, Brian? Sorry.
No, not at all. I mean, if you're ready to go.
Yeah, of course.
Yep, please.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Brian, for welcoming me to the event. And obviously, it goes without saying that we're all living through a number of very significant challenges at the moment, and indeed, any one of which is exceptionally difficult to navigate in its own right. But having things in combination is extremely challenging. Now more than ever, it's obviously imperative that we do work together to deliver our shared ambitions. And of course, the cluster is a great example of companies working together to achieve shared goals and in turn reaping the many benefits that collaborative working can bring. And it's in this respect I'm particularly grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm aware that not all delegates today represent members of the cluster. However, to see so many of you coming together to explore challenges and opportunities in delivering a net zero carbon industry does speak volumes for your commitment and foresight. And my commitment to you today on behalf of the Scottish Government is that the Scottish Government will continue to work with you to ensure that the maritime sector in Scotland continues to grow. We also seek to ensure that in our own policies, we're reflecting the needs of the maritime sector as much as we can. And I recognise that such ambitious targets place a significant challenge upon all sectors of society, not least at a time when we also face the uncertainty of Brexit and its impact of communities and the economy. I also understand the particular challenge of delivering environmental targets in what is a global industry. Equally, I have to acknowledge that the extent to which the Scottish Government can influence international policy in that respect is limited. However, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and therefore we will continue to work with the UK Government to convince them to try and influence and challenge other countries to adopt equally ambitious targets. And it's in this context that I want to turn to the Scottish Government's climate change targets, because our policy ambitions are deliberately challenging. They have to be if we're to make meaningful change. And our latest programme for government recognises and responds to the huge economic challenges that COVID-19's the pandemic has created. Scotland's world-leading climate change legislation sets a target date for net zero emissions of all greenhouse gases by 2045, and very challenging interim targets for 2030 of a 75% reduction in greenhouse gases relative to the 1990 baseline, and with a target of 90% by 2040. So you can see the nature of the challenge. And our contribution to climate change will end definitively within one generation if we achieve that 2045 target. To help achieve this, the Scottish Government's climate change plan states that we will increase the number of low or zero emission ferries in the Scottish Government fleet by 30% by 2032. We do remain committed and on track to achieving this target, supported by significant capital investment proposed through the Scottish Government's draft infrastructure investment plan. And we're also updating our climate change plan to reflect the increased ambition of the new targets set in the Climate Change Emissions Reductions Target Scotland Act of 2019. Investigations have begun into the electrification of ferries and the utilisation of other green energy solutions such as hydrogen or ammonia. And this work will feed into our future vessel programme as set out in the Vessel Replacement and Deployment Plan and into the Islands Connectivity Plan, which is the replacement for the current ferries plan, which will be in place from the end of 2022. The change in title reflects our wider take on connectivity, including aviation and obviously other aspects. But this builds on the successful introduction of 3 world-leading hybrid diesel electric vessels, through which we've been able to accrue considerable experience and data concerning the use of battery power in the marine environment and the supply of electricity for recharging in remote locations. Feasibility work is now underway and just helpfully my speech has disappeared. Feasibility work is now underway in terms of our aspirations for the next generation of small ferries should be able to operate in all electric systems. And we're looking at evidence from elsewhere in Northern Europe, which indicates that this is technically and operationally feasible and achievable. However, for lifeline ferry routes, we need to be confident in the technology before we commit significant investment. And of course, the electricity distribution system may also need investment in a number of localities in order to facilitate this too. And you'll appreciate the challenges all of this poses. We could significantly lower our emissions with the expanded use of diesel hybrid technology as well. But any new vessels will be in service for up to 30 years, well below the 2045 deadline, and consideration therefore also needs to be given into how ferries could be retrofitted or operated on alternative fuels in the future to ensure they contribute to achieve our net zero emission target for 2045. Now that said, ferries do not exist in isolation from the rest of the transport network and are almost always a leg on a journey, not a journey in themselves. So the Island Connectivity Plan will also look at how we integrate and encourage more active travel and public transport use across the country in line with the goals of the National Transport Strategy. A better provision and choices for all users will help us to meet our equality commitments on our ferries through greater integration of journeys with more sustainable modes of travel. And through this work, engagement will be undertaken with users, communities and other stakeholders to establish what is possible and indeed what is needed in our islands and remote mainland regions. Now turning to a different subject, but one related to this, Scotland is a world leader in marine renewable energy as a result of consistent and committed support from the Scottish Government, together with the expertise, investment and innovation of the industry. And I'm very grateful indeed for all the input I have through the Scottish Marine Energy Industry Working Group, which I chair. Good green jobs are central to our transition to net zero, and I believe firmly that our energy sector will play a crucial part in building a greener, fairer and indeed more equal society and economy. The Scottish Government therefore continues to champion the marine energy sector, supporting the research, development and innovation that will maintain Scotland's competitive advantage. And wave, tidal and wind energy play an important role in Scotland's future energy system and offer substantial export potential as part of Scotland's response to the global climate emergency. And Sharpine colleagues may have noticed that last week we published both the sectoral marine plan for offshore wind in final form, and also the offshore wind policy statement, which set a target for 11 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 in Scottish waters. And the Scottish Government backs industry proposals for the UK Government to develop revenue support mechanisms that provide a route to market for wave and tidal stream technologies as well. Scotland is home to a number of world-leading tidal energy projects, such as Nova Innovations, having installed the first two 100 kilowatt turbines in the Blue Mull Sound in Shetland in 2016, creating the world's first offshore tidal array. A third turbine was added in 2017, and Tesla's battery storage was added in 2018, and I believe the company are underway in further expanding that site. CMAL Atlantis' Energy's Maygen project in the Pentland Firth is the world's largest planned tidal stream array, up to 398 megawatts. Its 4 existing turbines as the first phases of the project have generated more than 24 gigawatt hours of electricity for the national grid and working very successfully. And Orbital Marine Power deployed the world's most powerful tidal stream turbine device in Orkney in 2016, the SR2000. And during the demonstration period, it exported over 3,250 megawatt hours of electricity to the Orkney grid during a 12-month period, and I believe was responsible for about 7% of Orkney's electricity supplies at that time. That company, Orbital Marine, are now developing a new turbine, O2 turbine, which is a further evolution of the SR2000 and looking like a very successful opportunity for them. And the energy transition will shape the future of this country and create significant opportunities for companies across all energy sectors. And a successful decarbonisation journey will be one which brings all sectors together to maximise the mutual economic opportunities that transition will bring. Furthermore, Scotland's oil and gas industry can provide much of the expertise and skills needed to support this transition, helping to design the diverse energy system we need for the future. There are over 100,000 people working in the sector and its supply chain in Scotland, and that's a tremendous pool of talent in which to use to further the development of the energy transition. And we also want to see more businesses diversifying into areas such as hydrogen production, both blue and green hydrogen, and the development of floating wind and marine energy. The oil and gas sector has over 40 years of experience of operating in what can be harsh, very harsh North Sea environments, and possesses vital subsea skills which can help overcome the engineering and innovation challenges presented by the move to a low carbon future. These skills, of course, are already being brought to bear in sectors such as solar, hydrogen, carbon capture, utilisation and storage, which is a huge opportunity in its own right, and offshore wind, which I've touched on earlier, both the fixed foundation and floating wind variants of offshore wind, which is all helping to decarbonise the oil and gas sector. And the sector itself has set a target for 2035 of eliminating the 15.8 megatons of emissions produced annually in the production process for oil and gas in UK waters. But finally, as a footnote to my earlier reference to COVID, I should also take the opportunity briefly to talk about the rescheduled UN Climate Change Conference, or COP26, in Glasgow next year. While it was obviously very disappointing to the organisers and indeed to all of us in Scotland to see the conference being postponed, it should have taken place obviously in November of 2020, it was undoubtedly the right thing to do. We look very much forward to welcoming delegates from across the world to the rescheduled COP in Glasgow in November 2021, and to helping deliver a good outcome for our climate. But our ambition for the conference is that we'll help increase global ambition in our shared endeavour to transition the world to net zero with a green recovery from COVID-19 that is both fair and just. And we will use the conference to promote our reputation on the international stage as a global leader on climate change, social justice, indeed climate justice, and well-being. And as someone who's attended two of these events in Qatar and Poland on behalf of Scotland, I know that it's a huge opportunity for Scotland to showcase what we are doing to tackle climate change and the companies that are leading that charge. Scotland will have a meaningful role in COP26, providing not only the platform for international engagement on climate change action, but also advocating crucial climate change priorities of social justice and just transition, and looking at the climate justice agenda as a human rights agenda in terms of the countries that have done least to cause climate change being those who are suffering most from it at this moment in time. And this all aligns very closely with the Scottish Government's world-leading climate change agenda and indeed legislative framework. Scotland has shown bold global leadership to address climate change and has amongst the most ambitious emissions targets in the world, as set out in the Climate Change Act, ensuring our contribution to climate change will end, as I said earlier, by 2045. Our commitment is to a just transition, leaving no one behind, learning from the move away from coal in the past, which was not handled well, and guaranteeing that the opportunities of a net zero economy will be accessible to everyone in Scotland. And this commitment serves to demonstrate to other countries the fundamental importance of putting citizens at the heart of a sustainable, inclusive and resilient recovery. And with this reputation as a world leader, because we genuinely do have that reputation, Scotland provides a strong platform from which delegates at COP26 can productively discuss decisive action on tackling climate change. And for many, they'll be able to see some of the technologies that are being deployed to do that for the first time in the field as well. So in closing, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I want to stress the importance of working together. We have very ambitious targets, but only together through a coordinated approach can we achieve our ambitions. So thank you for listening to me today. Sorry I cannot stay to hear other speakers later, but I'm sure you will find the rest of the event enjoyable and indeed very informative. Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you to all for listening to me today.
Just unmute myself. That's excellent. Thank you very much, Minister. It's always a delight to have you with us. Some fantastic things going on and some really inspiring stuff. We do have a little bit of time, I think, for questions. I think we have you until about half. Yep.
Yes, of course. Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to give that impression I'm ducking out. I'll try and answer them as best I can. Super.
So if people could use the Q&A function, I'll ask the questions directly. I have some here already. This is really about momentum. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. It's difficult to focus on anything else, but we need a positive and zero carbon future. So what's the Scottish Government's strategy to continue the carbon reduction momentum?
Well, we have in mind, Brian, we obviously are producing a climate change update, which is taking the climate change plan, which was put in place just 2 years ago in 2018, updating it for the revised targets that were set by Parliament in September of last year in the new Act, and making sure that we are looking at all our pathways with the new ambition. Obviously, transport and heat, which is perhaps less relevant to this audience, are two areas where we have made comparatively less progress than we would have liked. And clearly, Mr. Matheson, my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Transport Infrastructure and Connectivity, is looking very hard at what we can achieve across all transport modes and public and private transport. So we are committed to producing that by the end of this calendar year, so it will be out in December. That will then lead to a refresh of the Scottish Government's energy strategy over 2021. If we are successfully re-elected, we plan to publish that later in 2021, but before the election, we'll produce an energy policy statement which will give an indication of the sense of direction that would be pursued in the revised strategy. There are huge opportunities in areas like carbon capture, utilisation storage, and indeed the Acorn project in St Fergus in Aberdeenshire is looking to deploy logistical examples of how logistics of delivering carbon dioxide to Scotland for sequestration in our reservoirs such as Goldeneye Reservoir in the North Sea, how that can be delivered by 2026. So there's some exciting opportunities coming forward, not only to deliver a solution for Scotland's emissions, but potentially provide a solution for European nations to sequestrate CO2 and store it in Scotland. So there's economic opportunities that arise from that, but we are looking very hard at all our transport modes to see what we can do with technical options such as hydrogen, ammonia, electrification, and we've already announced plans for rail. Example, I see similar moves being aviation with the Highlands Islands, the first in the wave of decarbonisation. And I'm sure maritime, that Mr. Matheson is very keen to work with the maritime sector to see how we can decarbonise activities there as well.
Okay, thanks for that. You mentioned hydrogen in your speech. Could you elaborate on the Scottish Government's view on how much of the energy mix will be hydrogen? Do you expect Scotland to be involved in hydrogen production, or primarily for the use only or import perspective?
Well, it's a huge opportunity for Scotland. We are perhaps not unique in this sense, but I think we're pretty close to it in terms of having the combination of the oil and gas sector, the expertise in oil and gas sector, the potential for developing blue hydrogen off the back of the project up at St Fergus is obviously clear, but also the ability to generate green hydrogen in very large quantities, given we have 462,000 square kilometres of seas in our exclusive economic zone in Scotland, which blows my mind when I think of the scale of the area, and 6 times our landmass. So we have a huge opportunity here to develop offshore wind, produce green hydrogen for European nations that desperately need it to decarbonise the industrial clusters. We've had specific interest from the Low Countries in terms of Belgium and the Netherlands, but also from Germany in producing hydrogen. And indeed, there's now a collaborative cluster developing between Deep Wind, one of the 2 clusters in Scotland for the offshore wind sector, and their German counterparts to further opportunities, including the development of green hydrogen. So it's really exciting. So I think it can provide a great export opportunity to replace oil and gas, perhaps over the longer term in terms of as a generator of wealth for the Scottish economy. But clearly hydrogen also has a major role to play, both in terms of providing an alternative fuel for our heat sector and for transport modes. So in initial stages, we're looking potentially for the role of hydrogen to be key around larger vehicles such as HGVs, buses, refuse collection vehicles, where the kind of weight, power and weight sort of characteristics of the vehicles make it logical to look at that rather than perhaps very large batteries being used as alternatives. So we are exploring those opportunities as we speak, and the hydrogen assessment project that we are producing through consultants will be published, followed rapidly by a hydrogen action plan and policy statement to set out what the opportunities are for Scotland and the scale of ambition we have for hydrogen in our energy mix. So I'm quite excited about that. That'll all be happening in the next couple of months, and in terms of the progress on that. And I look forward to getting feedback from industry as to opportunities in areas like maritime for the use of hydrogen and derivatives such as ammonia, which could be a very useful drop-in replacement fuel for marine diesel.
Thank you. I'll maybe be greedy and just throw in one more question. We're pretty much on time, but one quick question.
Brian, I have one from the panelists.
Oh, sorry, Duncan. Yeah, on you go.
I have one from the panelists. Yes. Minister, bearing in mind what great work you've done to decarbonisation of Scottish ferry services, however, there's another aspect to this, which is decarbonising deep sea shipping, which needs international action through the IMO. What steps, if any, are the Scottish Government taking to ensure that the IMO takes this action?
It's a really important point, Duncan. I mean, we certainly recognise, this is what I was alluding to in my speech, that we obviously don't have a direct say in those international negotiations as we're not a nation state in that sense. But we can work through trying to encourage the UK government to be as bold as possible, obviously supplying evidence where that's helpful of opportunities that arise in Scotland. Clearly, we have, I know, quite strong interest in, from a commercial sense, in investing in refueling technology to provide opportunities for vessels that are using routes that have maybe opened up in the Arctic, which is obviously I suppose a sad indictment of where we are with climate change, that these routes are now open. But now that they are going to be seeing international shipping coming through that route, then can we provide refueling facilities, whether it's LNG at the moment or in areas in the future such as hydrogen or ammonia, to enable shipping to decarbonise. But we really are supportive of taking tough action on emissions and ensuring that there's a level playing field across the world. And we need obviously to use the routes to do that through the UK government and to work with UK ministers to try and set as ambitious targets as we can internationally and make sure there's a level playing field there that doesn't distort competition. But certainly it's something we are keen to do, Duncan. And if of course the industry has any advice or recommendations to Scottish ministers about how we can help either support that agenda and do it in a way which is done at a pace which the sector can adapt to, then they would be keen to hear that. So we're understanding both the practical implications of it, but also the opportunities that may come from that, from the point of view of shipbuilding sector, and indeed, as I say, providing services in Scottish ports to facilitate those newly decarbonised vessels to have the fueling that they need and bunkering and so forth that they need. So certainly open to any suggestions from you, Duncan, and others to how best we can achieve that.
Well, bear that in mind. Thank you very much.
Okay, and just my one final question. We're needing a Scottish maritime strategy, and understand that this has been paused for obvious reasons. Would you agree that the Scottish Maritime Cluster and its members have a part to play in its ultimate success? Absolutely, Brian. I know Mr. Matheson is very keen to, as soon as we can do, to push on with the maritime strategy. It was one of the things we first discussed when we came together as a new ministerial team, taking into account the needs of our ferry fleet, but more widely what we do to have a modern maritime strategy for the 21st century, and in the context of the green recovery and the global climate emergency as well. And it's something that we are a maritime nation. We've got a proud maritime history. We want to make sure we've got a policy environment that's fit for purpose for the 21st century and can help us seize the opportunities both for jobs but also for investment as well. So stakeholders on this call and more widely will have a really key role to play. We're not maritime specialists ourselves. We do obviously have very good officials in Transport Scotland who are, but we really need that input and insight that the industry can give us to make sure that Scotland's a really competitive place for investment, and that we've got a fighting fit maritime sector that is ready to not only cope but thrive in the climate that we can see coming from us. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that. I hope that the event generates some really good ideas, and I hope to see that sort of flow through into good policy decisions by ourselves to support the sector. But thank you. Minister, thank you very much for your time this morning. My pleasure, Brian. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next item of the agenda. We now have Kevin Hobbs and Declan MacDonald, and welcome to you both.
Yes, good morning. Kevin Hobbs here. I'm joined today by Declan MacDonald, who's our Assistant Technical Superintendent. So I'll just kick off if we can have the next slide, as Mr. Whitty says. So CMAL is Caledonian Maritime Assets Limited. We're owned by the Scottish Government, as the Minister mentioned. Being owned by the government, we're obviously very attuned to the climate emergency that the Scottish Government declared a number of years ago. We own the ferries that trade on the west coast of Scotland, the Clyde Estuary, and also the Northern Isles. And we also own a number of ports throughout the west coast as well. In terms of vessels, we have 31 which are leased to CalMac on the west coast, and 5 that are leased to Serco Northlink on Orkney and Shetland routes. There are, of course, other ferries which are owned by other entities, mainly the councils, but we have the majority of them, being 36 currently. Next slide, please. So in terms of our vessel replacement planning, and of course, what I must say is all of this is always subject to the funding. The funding for this organisation comes through Scottish Government. So if we look at the number of vessels which are required to be replaced, it is fair to say that in the past 20 years there has been not as much investment in ferries as we would have liked to have seen, and now we're in a position where we need to do an awful lot in a very short period of time. During the next decade, as you can see here, we have 7 Loch class vessels, which are the smaller end of the vessel fleet. The Minister mentioned the diesel electric hybrids that we developed back in 2012, of which we have 3 of them, and we'll come onto that later on. We have 3 sound route vessels. The sound route vessels, for those that don't know, operate Sound of Harris, Sound of Barra, and also across to Iona from Fort in Mull. We have 6 major vessels to complete. We have 2 under construction, but the 6 major ones are 6 more major ones in addition to the 2 under construction. And most recently, the network on the Clyde has been transferred into the Clyde and Hebridean ferry services, and we need to build 3 passenger vessels to service Gurrock, Dunoon and Kilcreggan. On the Northern Isles routes, out of the 5 vessels, we're currently in the process of designing 2 freight or freight plus vessels. The plus meaning that they will have more passenger capacity than the current ones. Current ones can only carry 12, but we're looking at an option to carry up to 200 people on the Northern Isles vessels. So next slide, please. So looking at the diesel electric hybrids, as I said, back in 2012, we developed this brand new technology. They're relatively small vessels with relatively small capacities. As you can see there, 23 cars, 150 passengers, can carry up to 2 articulated vehicles. So these aren't for the major routes on any of the networks, but the more minor routes. We have 3 in operation across the west coast of Scotland. The Hallaig was the first, followed by the Lochinvar, followed by the Katrina. In terms of CO2 emissions, the Hallaig reduced CO2 by approximately 30%. The diesel electric then carries out the rest of the day's work. And this technology, we believe at the moment, is much more suitable for smaller vessels. Although when looking at the larger vessels, we will also be looking at battery technology. We don't believe the battery technology at the moment is developed enough for the major vessels in their own right, but certainly they will have a part to play. There are a number of vessels out there currently which will be approaching port purely on battery power, and then when they're in port, they either just use pure batteries or they actually plug in when they're alongside. So when they're in close proximity to the land, the emissions basically become 0. Next slide, please. So as I said, 2012, you can see the picture there. That's the battery banks on board. Battery technology has improved since 2012. So in terms of the chemistry of batteries, and that then relates to the weight of the batteries, that has improved. We believe at the moment, and we're working on the replacement program for the 7 Loch class vessels, it is our belief that we will be able to get more electricity into the vessel, which means a longer working day. We also believe on certain routes that we can actually achieve full electrification. So that is a work in progress at the moment, but certainly following on from the Minister's view of climate change and investment in ferries, then we are working very, very hard to make sure that we play our part in making sure that there is decarbonisation. And of course, along with decarbonisation goes the reduction in emissions, which are also a major problem, both NOx, SOx and the particulate matters, which are basically emitted along with the carbon once you burn hydrocarbons. So we're very much looking forward to a green energy future. The technology in some cases is there, in others it's not quite there, but we will yet again push the envelope to make sure that we do the best we possibly can in the circumstances. And we will also make sure that when we're looking at the design of new vessels, whether they're small or large, that the ability to retrofit in the future is there, because when we say that we have the next decade to look at, obviously those vessels which are delivered within the envelope of 2025 to 2030 are likely to be lasting 30 years or maybe more than 30 years. So, you know, everybody can do the maths. That doesn't add up to 2045. So what we're building today will outlast the 2045 time frame, and we have to look at the potential for retrofitting as well as doing the best that we can with the technology that we have today. Next slide, please. So in terms of electrification, there are a number of challenges. We have to choose the correct routes. Again, it was mentioned by the Minister, the shoreside power has a very big part to play. It's pointless trying to go either partially or fully electric if the shoreside power and the grid will not support it. So that's something which we have to look at. We still operate in relatively shallow waters. Many of these type of vessels will operate to slipways as opposed to the more major ports. Vessel dimensions and shoreside infrastructure has to be looked at very carefully. And of course, battery technology is still developing. And at the moment, there is this offset between the weight of the batteries and the amount of cargo that you can carry. So yes, we can certainly, even with older technology, have a 100% electric ferry, but it's not much use if it can only carry 3 or 4 cars and 20 people. So it's always that balancing act that we're looking at in the short to medium term. And the next slide, I'll hand over to my colleague, Declan MacDonald.
Thank you, Kevin, and good morning all. So I'm going to take you through a few of the other projects that CMAL are currently engaged with. The first of which is our 2 dual-fuel LNG ferries, which are currently under construction at Ferguson's Marine in Port Glasgow. These ferries are approximately 100 metres in length and will be able to carry 130 cars or up to 960 passengers. The vessels will be able to run on liquefied natural gas or low sulphur marine gas oil, but we expect that most of the time it will be running on LNG. So LNG is currently classed as a transition fuel, which means in the short term, it will help us to meet the short-term climate change goals. But in the long term, it's not going to solve all of our problems. For CO2 emissions reductions in comparison with a traditional marine gas oil vessel, they're expected to be up to 20% less and up to 90% less NOx emissions and almost eliminating SOx emissions. So that will go a long way to helping achieve those kind of targets short term, but again, not in the long term. Some of the things we have to consider when looking at which fuel to use for these large ferries is the vessel route, which is very important. We have to make sure that they're not spending a lot of time manoeuvring or operating at low speeds where the engines might be lightly loaded and allow unburnt methane to slip out the engines in the form of methane slip. So we have to be careful for optimizing the engines and selecting the appropriate routes. As Kevin mentioned as well, we've got shallow waters, which means that the draft is restricted for the vessels. So we have to make sure that we can, first of all, fit the LNG storage facility on board the vessel and the associated weight that comes with that. And again, we are looking at replacing 6 major vessels in the next decade, and LNG will definitely be looked at very seriously, but all of these will need to be considered before we look at LNG as the option. Can we get the next slide, please? Okay, so some of the challenges that we've seen from CMAL so far for LNG, there are obviously a lot of benefits for LNG, but some of the things we've struggled with is the availability of the supply. At the moment, the LNG hub in the UK is in the Isle of Graeme in the southeast of England, and to one of our ports in Ardrossan, which you can see in the picture here, that's almost 400 miles that we'll have to truck the LNG up. So again, as LNG becomes more common, or in Scotland and the UK, we'll hopefully see a hub in Scotland in the near future. A challenge with a first of its type project in the UK is, of course, gaining HSE approval for shoreside infrastructure. So we've had to go through the HAZOPs, bunker safety studies, front-end engineering documents, all of which has been subcontracted to external kind of consultants. But it would be great if we could also have these kind of consultants in the UK or in Scotland itself to help guide us through the British standards, which would help speed things up. Another issue is determining whether health and safety are going to look at a risk-based approach, as they do in Europe, or if it's going to be more hazard-based, and that's something that we're still in discussion with. But again, as LNG becomes more common as a fuel, we'll get a clearer roadmap for future vessels. The shoreside infrastructure, a lot of our ports in Scotland, we've got limited space to work with. So these tanks can be large. The one in the picture here is almost 25 meters in length. So we need to, first of all, look at whether we can accommodate tanks nearby to the vessel. The LNG onboard infrastructure. So we need to find a location on board the vessel for a 25-meter tank, and that can weigh up to 80 tons. And when you include it with the LNG fuel weight, that takes up to almost 150 tons. And with a shallow draft, that causes quite a few problems. LNG hazards, it is a cryogenic, so the crew will have to be specially trained and supplied with the appropriate PPE. But also, if it comes into contact with steel, then it can cause brittle fractures. So around the LNG bunker station, for example, we'll have to have drip trays under the couplings and a water curtain outside of the bunker door to ensure that steel doesn't come into contact with the LNG. And next slide, please. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly touch on hydrogen. CMAL led the High Seas 1 and 2 projects, and we've recently just been asked back into the High Seas 3 consortium. And the aim of this consortium is to develop, construct, and certify an innovative hydrogen fuel cell drivetrain. And that will be done and proven in the form of a string test, which will be underway shortly. And simultaneously, we're also going to look at the concept design for a vessel which can house this powertrain. And the vessel and the route that we're looking at is the Shappensea. It's an island just off Kirkwall, up in Orkney. It's a 25-minute route, and it'll be able to hold about 100 passengers and maybe 15 cars and 2 HGVs. And it's important to note that even though this has been designed for this route, we are hoping that there'll be a lot of transferable aspects that we could potentially use to design elsewhere in Scotland, or indeed Scandinavia or other countries which are taking hydrogen very seriously at the moment. So we're going to award the contract for the concept design in the next month or two, and hopefully we'll have this completed by Q3 of 2021. And there's many partners on the consortium, but just a few to name are McPhee, who are looking at the landside infrastructure and the refueling. We'll have Bowers looking at the fuel cell, and also Kongsberg looking at the powertrain, and Orkney Island Council, of course, for managing the vessel. And with the upcoming 4 Loch class replacement in the near future, we could potentially look at using the hydrogen powertrain or the vessel design itself for one of these projects in the future, if everything goes well. Next slide, please. So yeah, just hydrogen, there is massive long-term potential here for small, medium, and potentially large vessels as well, if they can be refueled regularly, which might be an option for Scottish vessels on the West Coast. Some of the challenges we've seen so far, and as the project develops, I'm sure we'll see many more come out of this, but no distinct vessel regulations for design. At the moment, the IGF code covers the design of low flashpoint fuel vessels, but doesn't really make any reference to hydrogen, which is still done on a risk-based approach. And on a wider scale, the source of the hydrogen for the Isle of Shappensea, that will be from curtailed wind energy on the island, so it will be green hydrogen. But elsewhere in Scotland, it's not clear where this would be, as was touched on earlier with Brian's question to the Minister. And I'll just pass back to Kevin for the final slide.
Yeah, I guess in summary, there's an awful lot going on, and I guess one of the things that I would like to say and sort of emphasise is that, you know, as an organisation based in Scotland, owned by Scottish ministers, our view is that wherever possible, we would like to use, you know, the Scottish supply chain and the wider supply chain in the UK. What we're often finding at the moment is that we're having to go outside to European partners to find this. So I think one of the reasons for this particular presentation was to let people know that there is a lot going on. There's a lot of opportunity, and we as an organisation are relatively small. You know, we've got a run through of probably about £100 million a year at 35 staff. So, you know, we do outsource a lot of the things that we do. And really, I suppose our call is to, you know, please make contact with us and make sure that we, you know of your particular levels of expertise in these areas, so that hopefully we can use you in the future if we don't already. In summary, electric, there's issues with shoreside grid, vessel constraints. The shoreside infrastructure also causes us some issues, and we really need some energy density improvements, which goes along with the chemistry and the weight of the batteries to enable us to get to where we really want to be, which is purely electric, charging vessels overnight, and then having zero emissions. One of the major issues with LNG at the moment, as Declan alluded to, is that the only place that we can source LNG at the moment is the Isle of Graeme. When these vessels were originally muted back in 2014-15 and the contract was signed in October 2015, there were a number of projects where we believe that there would be a major hub within Scotland, either on the Clyde or in the Forth, and that hasn't come to fruition at the moment. But bearing in mind these vessels will be around for 30 years, then you know, hopefully that will come along sooner rather than later, because it is a great shame that we're hauling, albeit with an LNG powered truck, all the way from the Isle of Graeme up to Scotland and the intermediate tanks, which Declan has mentioned. Hydrogen, fairly obviously, is a you know, a fantastic potential for powering ships in the future. Sources of hydrogen on some island chains are fine, on others they're not. There are certainly challenges in terms of design of vessels and first of class and stuff like that, so we have to work very closely with classification societies, etc. And the shoreside infrastructure, refueling at small scale, and obviously the onboard infrastructure. So, you know, across the piece, whether it's training people on ships, whether it's, you know, assisting us legally, assisting us technically, you know, manufacturing some of the parts for what we need to do, it's very, very clear that there is a, you know, there is a great challenge ahead of us. And with the number of ferries that we were mentioning in one of the first slides, you know, the cost is going to be somewhere in the region of £500 million. So, you know, there is great opportunity out there, and I would just ask you all to make contact with us if you think you can help us on the journey. So thank you for listening, and hand over to the next presenter.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Declan. If I could remind everybody to submit questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. These will be put to the panel towards the end of the event. We've already got a couple of questions coming in. We'll ask those towards the end. So I'd now like to hand over to Neil Kermode, Managing Director of the European Marine Energy Centre. Welcome, Neil.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Brian. Brian, could you just confirm you're seeing you're seeing the screen now?
Yes, can see you.
Right. Good morning, everybody, and very interesting to hear the presentation so far. I'm going to explain a little bit about what's going on in Orkney and give a bit of context as to why the European Marine Energy Centre is involved in hydrogen and some of the other things that are going on. First of all, when you think of Orkney, and I'm pleased to say this audience pretty much should know where we are, you probably think of scenery and the architecture and the archaeology and the views, etc. You probably don't necessarily think of the scale of what's going on with the local supply chain mobilizing to put marine renewables in the sea. Top right hand corner is one of the tidal turbines that the minister mentioned by Orbital Marine Power, which I'll talk more about in a moment. putting in hydrogen and also low energy housing and embedded renewables. So it's an energy related, there's a lot of energy related activity that's going on in Orkney as a whole. And one of the reasons why is that Orkney is very much seeing itself as a place where we're slightly ahead, and we're seeing some of the problems that everybody are going to encounter with energy. One of our colleagues, Solo Energy, produced a graph a little while ago, quickly showing what happens in the UK at the moment with renewables, and that's the green line at the bottom. The zigzag line at the bottom is what happened in the month of August in 2019 for renewables, and the electricity demand for the UK is shown in the grey line. And you can notice there's a zigzag pattern, which is principally solar, and then the wave pattern for the green is pretty much wind. And they looked at what happens if you quadruple the amount of renewables on the network, and you end up with this. And the point is that this is what Orkney's energy system looks like now. In other words, we're seeing an energy system which is very similar to what the UK will be encountering in the not too distant future. So we've been working on a number of projects which have spread out from just marine energy out into other spaces, and that's been driven very much by work that's been done to look at the energy picture in Orkney as a whole. An energy audit was undertaken back in the 2014-15 period and refreshed in 2019, and that showed how we are using our energy in this Sankey diagram. In effect, what is going on is it shows the fuels that we use are broken out there, and we've got a lot more detail which shows how those fuels are being used. And you notice at the top, heat and light are the top two major segments, but transport is also extremely significant to us. And I'm going to talk briefly about the two areas I've put in green boxes. First of all, about the ferry services and the marine side of things, and then also a little bit about off-island flights, because there's things going on there as well. So we started off very much working on hydrogen from tidal energy, principally because the grid is inadequate to take all the energy we're harvesting from the water. And similarly, there's a huge amount going on with wind energy locally as well, and that too can't be put into the grid because the grid was built quite reasonably to bring energy to a small community of 20,000 people. It wasn't designed to take an epic amount of energy from what amounts to a marine power station back into the grid. So we've had to do other things whilst we wait for better connections. This is a picture of our first electrolyzer we had, which is a 0.5 megawatt electrolyzer, which is presently being upgraded to 600 kilowatts. This is on the Isle of Ely, where we also put in 0.5 ton of gas storage, which are some of the cylinders in the foreground, and trucks to then take that hydrogen down to the port in Kirkwall, where it's then used to cold iron some ferries. This is a project that was brought into existence principally by ourselves and Community Energy Scotland, because they were helping the Edy Renewable Energy community-owned turbine company, you can see in the back of that picture. And together we realized that was there something we can actually do? We're using our tidal turbines to power the ferries that are going through the waters. Because that ferry, well, one of the 9 ferries that operates in Orkney, uses around about 16 megawatt hours of diesel a day. Is there something we could do about it? And we looked more widely and realized that the ferries between them use around 3 million litres of gas oil per year. So can we do something to put a dent in that carbon addiction? And we look very hard about whether this is possible. So we've been involved in a number of projects, but our side principally has been that of, can we make hydrogen? Can we then transport it? And then can we use it? Interestingly, we started off originally thinking we would take hydrogen and turn it back into electricity. That was our first plan. But some work we had done by Element Energy with Exodus showed the difference in the value of hydrogen. And if you look on the bottom right-hand corner of that graph, it shows that regen, i.e. turning hydrogen into electricity, the hydrogen is worth about 30 pence a kilogram. On the left-hand side of the graph, you see the value of turning into hydrogen for fuels, or using hydrogen for fuel cell cars. So it's about £6.5 per kilogram. In other words, it's much more cost effective to use hydrogen for transport than it is for turning it back into electricity. So this was the piece that was a big jump for us. What should we be using the hydrogen for once we're making it, and that led us very much to being involved in the marine space. Could we help decarbonize the 3 million litres of fuel oil that's in use? So that led us into a project which, first of all, the surf and turf project, which is about cold ironing the vessels by having a fuel cell on the pier side, which supplies electricity to them. And then that led us into the big hit project, and then subsequently into the high dime project, which is putting hydrogen afloat, because the initial part of cold ironing was hydrogen ashore, supplying shoreside power. The next stage was getting hydrogen out onto the water, and that work is going on at the moment. There's a UK research and innovation project underway called the High Dime project, which has got hydrogen tanks put into the vessel, the Shappensea vessel, and we're looking to put that in for running an auxiliary engine, or supplying hydrogen to an auxiliary engine. Now, interestingly, whilst we were working on this, we came across the fact that the UK Maritime Plan had been produced, and this is a diagram from that, which really shows what can be done with energy as a whole, and looking at different fuels. And we've started on the left-hand side with renewables, either wind or other renewables, and we're trying to get to a point where we've got an electric propulsion system. And what we've had to do is go on a bit of a journey to find out how we can actually make this work. In fact, we didn't get as far as propulsion. We've only got as far as auxiliary systems, and because of various regulatory issues. And we're now on another attack on this to try and find another way to take the hydrogen into the combustion engine to eventually get to propulsion. But I think it was Matt Declan mentioned, getting through the regulatory thicket is no mean feat. And there's another piece I just did want to talk about very briefly. I'm conscious we started a bit late. Was that of the fuels of use. The Minister mentioned ammonia, and indeed we too have been looking at a variety of fuel types. There was a piece of work done in the MarRI project, which I urge you to look at, which looked at the future of hydrogen as a fuel for inland shipping. And I think many of the issues that they've unearthed will exist for what we're trying to do. And personally, we have some concerns that the storage of the large quantities of hydrogen needed for industrial shipping is going to be a challenge, and we think probably there is scope for ammonia and methanol and other liquid fuels made from hydrogen, rather than necessarily just focusing on hydrogen as the end game. And it's not just us, people like Wärtsilä have pretty much said, look, I don't care what you want, we'll make ships and I'll burn whatever you need or use whatever you need. So the point is that I think the jury's still out, and we shouldn't just fixate purely on hydrogen. The other piece I did want to touch on very quickly is other bits of transport, just to let you know what else is going on, because going back to the other box, the off-island flights, we're also working on looking at whether we can decarbonize aviation. And I think this is potentially important because the liquid fuels that get produced for aviation may themselves also be able to be used in marine uses. So I think there's a synergy here rather than a competition. But once again, the statistics for the airport, you remember airports, they're those things we used to use. The airports effectively gave off around nearly 7,000 tons of CO2 from the activities going on. And so we're involved in a project which is at the moment is electrifying an aircraft, which is then being converted to take hydrogen fuel, the hydrogen into a fuel cell to provide the electricity to run the engine. And that aircraft has done its first electric flights and is now due to be doing a demo flight in the very near future. So the point is, overall, we had to come up with some hydrogen refueling infrastructure, which we've got in this truck, which gives us small scale for hydrogen. But really, the results I just wanted to conclude on is that really what we're seeing is we are learning by doing. By the act of starting off on our journey with marine energy, which led us towards hydrogen, it's meaning that we are understanding the bigger energy picture. And I think somebody mentioned it's a holistic approach that needs to be taken. And fuel efficiency is going to be critically important, not just a case of replace like for like. We are creating pre-commercial knowledge through the act of practical demonstration, and we are making progress to net zero on both land, sea and air. And I'm very happy to take any questions at the appropriate time. Thank you very much indeed.
That's great. Thanks, Neil. And thanks for noticing that we're slightly behind time as well. We have now caught up a little bit, so appreciate that. Excellent presentation. Lots of great things happening in Orkney at the moment. I'm going to move on quickly. The time to ask questions at the end. We're now joined by Ben Murray, Director of Maritime UK. Welcome, Ben.
On the wrong.
Here we go. Can see you now. Oh. We're going to get Ben. No. I wonder if
can you hear me?
Can hear you now, Ben.
Yeah, I can see myself. It was just the problem with the two screens. But hopefully you can hear and see me. Brilliant. Thanks very much, Brian. And thanks to everybody else presented previously as well. There's some really interesting and quite exciting projects there. I just wanted to start by picking up on, I think, Douglas's points at the start in terms of joining the dots together. That's very much what Maritime UK is here to do and is being created to do. And I wanted to just start by reminding people, or perhaps informing people, about who we are and how we work with the Scottish Maritime Cluster. Maritime UK is the umbrella body for the United Kingdom's maritime sector, and it brings together a combination of what we call national industry trade bodies with regional and national cluster organisations. So the job in doing that is to find the common areas of focus and interest across the sector and make more progress collectively by pulling in the same direction than we would on our own. And just to be clear about who we cover in terms of the maritime sector, there are 5 broad industries that we focus on, and they are the marine engineering, manufacturing, science and technology, the shipping industry, the ports industry, the professional services industry, so shipbroking, arbitration, insurance, finance, law, that sort of thing, and then also the leisure marine industry, which includes inland waterways and anything up to super yachts and marinas. And in bringing those different industries together, we also bring together the cluster organisations such as the Scottish Maritime Cluster. Others will have heard of Mersey Maritime, the South West Cluster, the Solent Cluster, and a growing number. And having done that, we find our common cause, and those are identified across 5, and they are around regional growth, innovation, people, competitiveness, and the environment. And clearly today's discussion sits within a number of them, but perhaps most clearly within the environment. And government, the UK government we're talking about here, asked the industry to form a strengthened Maritime UK to be a more compelling voice in terms of its engagement with government, but also to do exactly what you're doing here and joining things up. Because of all the challenges and projects that have been presented here today, very few are siloed, that word's being used, and require collaboration across the piece. And one area where we've done just that as a sector with our members, a combination of those national industry bodies across those 5 industries and regional cluster organisations such as the Scottish Cluster, we've worked together on the spending review. So what I've been asked to do is to talk through the spending review process that we've all worked together on, which many of the projects that have been spoken about here and other speakers have identified that a missing link often in accelerating and scaling up these projects has been comparable public funding, either comparable in the sense of other parts of the economy, other sectors receiving investment, or other competitor maritime nations receiving significant support from the public purse in those contexts. So what I'll do is I'll just take us through this spending review process, what we've done together, and then I'll update on where we've got to and where we find ourselves and what the opportunities are in the short and medium term. So this first slide has a couple of the graphics that we've been using through this spending review campaign. You can see the headline figure there that we've been talking about, which is £1 billion and we've spoken about kick-starting a world-leading maritime decarbonisation programme. And then clearly recognising the political interest across the UK government at the moment in shipbuilding, hooking ourselves to that campaign and presenting ourselves as having a solution to the ambition to grow the shipbuilding activity across the UK. So if we pop to the next slide. Wonderful. So this is a bit of an inside look at some of the way that we've been presenting this this spending review bid that we've worked on to officials, to special advisors in the government, and to ministers. We positioned the sector quite rightly and recognised the role that the sector had played in maintaining the flow of freight in and out of the country through well, day in, day out, but clearly in a heightened way, and in a way that a spotlight was shone upon us through COVID, and that will be the case again through different degrees of lockdowns that are returning across the UK. We wanted to then position ourselves, as there was mood music around building back better and a green recovery. We wanted to align ourselves with that and position ourselves as a major driver of that. So we worked with all government departments that we work with on this, and in particular with the Department for Transport, albeit with other departments too. And this is an example of a presentation that we gave to talk through parliamentarians about the work that we wanted MPs in Westminster to do to try and put pressure on ministers and their ecosystems to support the maritime sector in the context of decarbonisation and the funding bid. So I'm going to talk through a little bit more about the bid content and how the money would be spent and where we've got to with that bid. So if we could pop to the next slide, please. Great. I'm not going to go through all these in huge detail. We all sit in events where we pat ourselves on the back about the size of the sector, but just three key stats we produce, and in partnership with the Scottish Cluster through Scottish Enterprise, or vice versa, the Centre for Economics and Business Research produced Economic Impact Study, which quantifies the role and contribution of the sector and its future, its contribution across GVA, exports, jobs, treasury contributions, and so on. And that shows that all in, the sector contributes £46.1 billion to the UK economy and just over 1 million jobs. And then you've got key stats there about this is clearly in a COVID context, about the proportion of goods and resources that arrive into the UK on vessel. And also clearly we've been keen to pick up quite clearly on the government's levelling up agenda and its focus on reindustrialising and supporting parts of the country that perhaps have seen significant industry leave and become see their socioeconomic indicators fall. And that's where we've highlighted the role particularly of ports, but not just ports, in terms of supporting coastal communities. And that figure clearly pre-COVID shows how much ports invest of private capital through pension funds and other infrastructure investors and other financing solutions of around £600 million a year. So that's how we start this presentation to MPs, and then we move on, I think, into the substance, if we can. Yeah, the most significant thing that's worth mentioning here, I think, whilst productivity as a UK government ambition has probably slipped away a little bit, whereas the focus presently is on jobs, full stop, understandably when there's a jobs crisis and unemployment is rising, but we have a good story as a sector across the UK to tell in terms of productivity, which is significantly above the national average, as is pay. Is £9,000 above the UK and national average. We also have these figures, as I alluded to, for Scotland only, but they are aligned with the rest of the UK and there's no double counting across. Then this is where we start to whet the appetite of the parliamentarians and ministers, where we talk about the size of the sector. It's forecasting to double to 3 trillion. This is the breadth of the sector. There's anything from aquaculture through to movement of people and goods. And we specifically talk about the figures that have been bandied around in terms of the cost it will likely incur to decarbonise the sector. And you've got that last bullet point there around $1.5 to $2 trillion globally, which is a massive amount of money. But two key points that naturally fall from that. One is that there's a massive market here for first movers, early movers, and those who have credible, competitive products and services to offer, not just in terms of manufacturing, but also clearly in terms of professional services, expertise in that space. And I know it's clearly a major USP for the Scottish sector. but also in terms of finance as well, green finance to help fund the transition, but also finance that's backed through green sources. But the second point is it also shows that there needs to be public investment, because the transition of this size and scale has not occurred in history, and public financing will be required to help that transition along. So next slide, please. So this is the bid that we put together. Clearly, there's a huge amount of detail that sits behind this, and just a huge thanks to probably everybody on the call, our members, our national trade body members, and our regional cluster members provided hugely useful detail, evidence, data, projections, forecasts, their own company planning processes shared with us, and those were shared with officials that we're working on this bid with too. And the aim really in terms of responding to the Chancellor of the Exchequer's ambitions for the spending review were to talk about highly skilled, well-paid green jobs to get us to net zero, and recognise that real political imperative on having something to say on shipbuilding. So if we go into the next slide, we get into how this money would be spent. So there's been a lot of reference, particularly on the last presentation, to other modes, to other sectors, and how we can surely work collaboratively across different parts of the economy, but also learn from their experience and their success in transitioning, or at least kickstarting their own decarbonisation process. And ourselves with government recognise that the automotive industry across the UK has had a very good story to tell here and has demonstrated positive movement. And primarily the manifestation of government support for the sector in terms of significant R&D funding and also the infrastructure funding has been through the Office for Low Emission Vehicles as a sort of a quango that sits within the Department for Transport, and it then channels funds out to consortium in terms of grants and so on. So the idea was that we would replicate that with a UK maritime version, and the name that we settled on was UK Shore, which was the UK shipping, I think it's the Office for Shipping Emissions Reduction, a combination of those words in some order. So if I now go through to the next slide, I'll talk about how that money would be spent and what it would deliver. So that £1 billion of investment that we were seeking would be split between a combination of R&D funding for different stages of technology readiness. So from those that are probably viable and deployable, but grants would be helpful for, to those technologies that, such as MarRI-UK is being funding, that are needing different levels of cash injection to support the realization of those projects. And I know Richard will talk in a moment about one such example of that. And then also at the other end, this moonshot category of innovation, which are more radical, more innovative, and the proportion of those that succeed is significantly less. However, they might be fundamentally transformational. And that's the same balance of R&D spending in terms of the proportion of that fund across those different stages of R&D investment that we saw from the automotive sector. So again, following the success that we'd seen in automotive. There was also to be around £200 million of plug-in grants for port infrastructure and primarily around electric charging points too, but as well as the bunkering that would be needed for new fuels. And I think the point that's worth mentioning here is we've got the Centre for Economics and Business Research to do some analysis of this investment, and it's in terms of its models, how it's modelled the sector and similar R&D and infrastructure investment. And it thinks that investment would create, despite the level of productivity, it would still create a total throughout the supply chain of around 74,000 jobs. That figure there is wrong, 72,600 jobs. And clearly from a political point of view, it's been our interest to highlight that the majority of those would be in coastal areas, such as the location of the sector in a sort of a significant sense. So if we pop to the next slide, these are some of the figures that we'd worked out in terms of what it would deliver, and that's an 82, I think it's a metric ton equivalent of carbon dioxide by 2050. And then the second point here is around, others have spoken about it, about perhaps being a little bit slow off the mark. And this is a recognition that because there is so much to do and so little has comparatively happened in this sector compared to something like automotive, the return on investment and the scale of positive response to that intervention from government is significant. If we pop to the next slide. And this is the slide really that sort of gets to the point when we're talking to decision makers. I heard somebody else earlier talk about the life cycle of a ship, and I heard 30 years mentioned, and the obvious response to that is we're talking about 2050. We're now in 2020. There really does need to be significant intervention from the state, from public funding now. And this is a slide that you might think is a little bit unwise to share, but it's one that is very true. We can't, as a sector, ask for significant government funding for the sake of it. We have to have that supported by evidence, and this is from the DfT's Clean Maritime Plan, so it's something that's is well founded. Because so much moves, as we all know on this call, moves by ship. Even though it's by far the most efficient mode for moving goods, because of the size and scale, the sheer quantity that does move by ship means that the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions from shipping as a mode is greater, as you can see here, in the domestic sense than rail and buses combined, both of which have received significant government investment to help it get to net zero. So that point is important. We've got to show that there's a real pressing, urgent need, and if the UK government doesn't act in the way that we're asking it to, there is a real chance that we won't make our net zero commitments, which is the sort of language that government needs to work and hear from us. Then there's another couple of points here that the argument we've been making to government is that they might think you could just simply regulate your way to this. We don't think that's the right approach. We don't think that would work. And more importantly, perhaps than that, you could take a laissez-faire view, and you could say, as I think Kevin was talking about earlier, you could get the solutions from other maritime centres. But we're a first mover in terms of legislating to net zero. We have a Clean Maritime Plan. We have COP. We have huge ambition and commitment here. We want to ensure that as much of the transition to net zero from a use point of view, from an owner point of view, is actually making sure that the UK benefits from that, and UK companies and supply chains benefit. So clearly there's a nod there to net zero too. And just to give you a bit of feedback, I think this is my last slide, I'm conscious of time. In terms of where we are, we, as you'd expect, we launched a comprehensive campaign of political lobbying with all parties, with special advisors, with Downing Street, with different departments, with ministers, and we got to a place where, after quite a bit of tense negotiation and lobbying, the plan that we put forward was actually supported. The Secretary of State told us that he backed those plans, so that for the first time ever, the Department for Transport had put on the Chancellor's desk this £1 billion funding package. Now, it doesn't mean it's a done deal, but what it does mean is, for the first time, that's happened, and it hasn't happened in the past. So that's real progress. Obviously, as you'll now know, the spending review process has been changed. It's likely to be a single-year spending review settlement, and that means that there will probably be there will be a much more scaled-down green recovery element of the spending review, probably just meaning that key government spending can continue. However, there are a number of opportunities that remain for us to shape. There will be a multi-year spending review within the next 12 months, and there will be, as I've pointed out here, the Prime Minister has a 10-point plan for green recovery. The first of those 10 points was announced about a month ago in terms of offshore wind, and that too is an opportunity for us. And I could talk perhaps in questions, or people can follow up about what the response there is for this sector. We'll be working with our members in the coming days to put together an offshore wind plan to make sure that the sector, looking at shipbuilding through to ports being locations and so on, and the crewing and the operations, to make sure that the sector is fully benefiting from this prime ministerial ambition on offshore wind. There's the transport decarbonisation plan, which this ambitious bid is within. And then there's also there's also a point about the quality and I guess the strength of bid that we've put together. I think it's been fair in the past. Government have said quite clearly that the sector hasn't necessarily always had the quality of compelling argument. The fact that everybody worked together to pull in the same direction to develop a business case here means that we are ready to be fleet of foot to respond to any other opportunities, be they strengthened places, but the or other programs that are run throughout the UK. But the really important thing is that there is political support for this now. The Conservative Environment Network included our bid within their manifesto for the spending review. MPs are backing us, and the Secretary of State and various departments are backing the sector. So I'll just go to the final slide just to demonstrate where this all ends up. You might have seen this. This is part of how we do this work together in terms of getting this bid in front of decision makers, marrying that with parliamentary activity. And just to show you a snapshot of that from a Scottish perspective, my final slide is here. You've got an MP there from Wales standing up talking about the bid that we all put together, and you've got a couple of SNP MPs there together, and Brian, Duncan and ourselves have been working with the SNP group and other MPs such as there are in Scotland from other parties, and that work will continue. But the key message is it's about all pulling in the same direction, making sure everybody's feeding in together. And I generally think there's been positive movement on this, albeit the goalposts have moved. I think we can be confident that there will be a form of government intervention in this direction in the not too distant future. Thanks, Brian.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for that, Ben. Some very clear messages there from Maritime UK, and good to see all the hard work that's going on supporting the industry. Conscious of time, we're about 10 minutes behind at the moment. I'd now like to welcome Graeme McKinley from Babcock LGE, and welcome, Graeme.
Hello there, good morning. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk this morning. As the header slide here says, I'm going to talk about some of the technologies that we have developed within Babcock LGE to enable the transition to net zero. And given the slide, the time, we'll just crack on. Very quickly introduce Babcock and Babcock LGE to you. Babcock LGE, the LGE aspect stands for Liquid Gas Equipment Limited, and we're a wholly owned subsidiary of the Babcock International Group, an EPPM company that's the market leader in providing environmentally focused and engineering-led cargo handling and fuel gas systems. The focus on environment and engineering-led designs is a baseline and the focus of all of our technologies, and it's really what we do and what we bring to the industry. Primary customers are the shipyards that manufacture gas ships primarily, and they're typically in South Korea, China, Japan, but also the vessel owners, the end recipients of these ships, and energy majors who charter gas ships from the ship owners. And you can see from the image there, we're based at Rosyth Naval Base. You don't have to explain where Rosyth is to most groups of people, and I'll leave that just as Rosyth, you know what it is. And finally on this slide, just want to mention the top right hand side of the screen. Very quickly, in 2016, we were awarded 2 Queen's Awards for international trade and innovation. And earlier this year, we were a finalist in the Royal Academy of Engineering's McRobert Award. And the product that we developed, the technology we developed for that award, I'll discuss later in the slides. Next slide, please. We've touched on this quite a bit today in general sense of the words, so I won't labour the point too much, but I'll set the scene slightly if I can. So the International Energy Agency, the IEA, investigating the stated policy scenario, this leftmost curve you can see, predicts that the energy demands will rise by 1% per year until 2040, generally, globally. And of that 1% growth in energy demand, around 50% of that will be led by low carbon sources, which of course is excellent. But the next major component of that will be an increase by about 35% of natural gas, boosted by the rising trade in LNG, in liquid natural gas. Now, it's that aspect about LNG that I'm going to focus a bit of this presentation on. You know, if we take that consideration at face value, 35% growth in LNG over the next 20 years is part of the energy mix, of course. The world needs it, globe needs it, but we need to make sure that that is done the most environmentally and responsible way possible. You know, there's no point focusing all our attention on renewables. Of course, it's important. If 35% of the energy mix going forward is going to be LNG, then if that is bad for the environment and done irresponsibly, then, you know, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. We're missing an opportunity anyway. So the transition we're in just now is that the heavy carbon, hydrocarbon, oil and coal is transitioning out of that, and we're into this mid-range energy transition fuels that was mentioned earlier by Declan, that such as LNG, which is this transition fuel. The end point is going to be this zero carbon renewable based fuel economy we can get to, hydrogens, ammonias, and I'm going to touch on them slightly later. That's where we want to get to, you know, and it's all part of that transition. So from our perspective, as mentioned, whilst we're already considering what the future energy mix will look like, especially for the maritime industry and the world as a whole, we recognise that LNG is going to play a significant part, and therefore it's our challenge to develop technology to make that as efficient as possible for global transportation of liquid gas, and then specifically LNG here. Next slide, please. And taking that on further, let's look at some of those, the legislation in place, specifically in the marine market. So this is the taken from the IMO's strategy here, which is, to paraphrase, reducing CO2 emissions by at least 40% by 2030, pursuing efforts to 70% by 2050 compared to the 2008 level, which is in contradiction, of course, to what I was mentioning earlier, in that we're going to try and, the energy demand is going to increase. So if we're going to increase the energy demand at the same time, bring down levels to 70% to 2008 levels, we need to do some serious work to improve the way in which we produce CO2, or reduce the way we produce CO2. Knowing, of course, that the global fleet is due to double by 2050 as well. So this graph on the right-hand side, you can see is what I'm trying to focus on. There is no single solution, I think we've touched on that as well today, that's going to solve the problem of CO2 production within the maritime industry, especially in the short term. You know, we need to look at, well, these three areas here that will all work towards reducing that CO2 generation. And I'll touch on them very briefly. The key areas for us is Babcock LGE. The first one at the top of that curve is blue, the blue area, and that is the use of technical measures or technology. So improving the use of technology on board the ships will help reduce the CO2 production. And one of those models, one of those pieces of technology is EcoSmart, and I'll touch on that in the next slide. The other areas are the orange band, which is to improve the operational efficiencies. Another area for us that we look at here is greater use of technology in terms of remote monitoring, plant monitoring for condition-based maintenance, for example, is a system we're looking at just now. If we can make sure the plants on the ship operate to the utmost efficiency for the life of that ship, you know, noting that's 35, 40 years for an LNG carrier, then you're going to get the best return in terms of efficiency and therefore reducing the CO2 production as best you can. Finally, the last part is alternative fuels, and that's massive, of course. You can see the large green area there. LNG has been around for a long time as an alternative fuel, but you know, as the guys at CMAL were saying, that it's taking a long time to transition into all areas of marine. LNG carriers are one aspect, sure, but you know, it's taken a long time to get there. So when we look at other gases like LPGs, ammonias, you know, we all need to work together to really get to a place where we're happy in installing that from an infrastructure perspective, from a technology perspective, which is a long way to go. But again, we'll touch on that. Next slide, please. If I look at EcoSmart specifically, what EcoSmart stands for is ecological and economic single mix refrigerant technology, EcoSmart. And effectively we designed this back in 2015 with our first contract 2018, and by the end of this year we expect to have 10 of these in operation, and 45 contracts. The principle of what it does is an LNG carrier carries liquid natural gas, LNG, in liquid state, and it's about a minus 163 degrees Celsius, give or take. Now, as you can imagine, that liquid at minus 163 wants to boil off in any area of the world, and what we have is that vapor is called boil off gas. That's that, and that vapor needs to be managed. Now, previously, products for reliquefaction, that's the process of turning that vapor back into liquid, were cumbersome, they were large, they were hard to operate, expensive. And the issue with that, it is an opportunity for others like us and what we saw from EcoSmart. So instead of installing reliquefaction equipment, what happened in the past was the boil of gas would be used as a fuel, which is great, but any excess would just be burned. And the burning aspect for that causes CO2. You know, it's not something that we need to burden ourselves with, is creating more CO2. So the reliquefaction process that we develop help manage not creating CO2 and turn that back into the tanks. There's an economic aspect there too, of course. You know, if you're not burning your cargo, then you're saving money, which has another aspect too. But you know, the focus for us is giving our customers an economic benefit, of course, but the environmental aspect is clear to see. And that's what I'm going to touch on now. If you go to the next slide, these are some of the figures for you. Yeah, on the left-hand pie chart, what you can see there is if we take an assumption of a ship, an LNG carrier traveling at say 11 knots, based on a number of assumptions, but bear with me. About a quarter of that boil-off gas is going to be used in the main engine. The auxiliary engine that gives the hotel load for the ship is there, give it 10, 15%. If only 25% is used for the main engine and 10, 15% for the auxiliary engine is consumed from the boil-off gas perspective, there is a leftover 60% that needs to be managed. And previously, if there was no reliquefaction process on board the ship, what that would result in would be burning from this gas combustion unit, just burning that gas. If we have an EcoSmart system on board the ship, that's what we resolve. So there's speed the same, 24, 25% bulk would go to the main engine. There's a little bit extra for the auxiliary engine because our system has a compressor, it has an energy demand. But as you can see in the green box, the green segment of the pie chart, 56% of that boil-off gas that would normally be wasted can now be reliquefied and sent back to the cargo tank. Now, if you're looking at some figures here, that's without EcoSmart in this scenario for a 174,000 cubic meter LNG carrier, which is the standard LNG carrier in the fleet today, for new buildings anyway, that's around 2 tons an hour of LNG you're just burning. And that's what we can then capture approximately 2 tons an hour of that LNG. Now, again, if you look from the graph on the right-hand side, what that equates to in CO2 production, so if you don't have an EcoSmart system and you're burning that boil-off gas per voyage, let's say roughly in 30 days, you're producing 3,200 tons of CO2 per voyage under that base of, under those assumptions. And equate that over a year, over 6 laden voyages, that can equate to 19,000 tons of CO2 produced that you really don't need to do if you have a system in place. And then if you take that even further, this is per vessel per year, I have to admit. So if you then take that for the 45 EcoSmarts that we're about to put in place, what EcoSmart is therefore doing is removing CO2 production across 45 vessels per year to around about 850,000 tons of CO2 per year. And these ships can last 30, 35 years. So you can quickly see how much of an impact this kind of technology will do to improve the performance of these ships. Next slide, please. That's technology from an improvement in an LNG carrier perspective. We've talked a lot about alternative fuels today. I'll touch on that briefly. We've worked over the last 2 or 3 years to develop what we call Eco FGSS. That's a fuel gas supply system. And what that does is it allows the delivery of LPG to be used for in a dual fuel engine, an LPG dual fuel engine. LPG has a number of benefits, of course, and again, it was touched on by Declan. It virtually eliminates CO2, sulfur oxide emissions, SOx emissions, has a lower percentage, lower consumption compared to compliant fuels, and it's less volatile with those low sulfur fuels. It's certainly something we saw at the beginning of the year with the 2020 sulfur cap that came in. The infrastructure for LPG is also already established, and that's important, especially when you consider LPG carriers. You know, they carry these things, the infrastructure's there, and so LPG can be used as fuel. It's not for every vessel, of course, but certainly for the deep sea going vessels, especially LPG vessels, it makes a lot of sense. And we've got 10 of these, over 10 of these LPG systems to be installed over the coming couple of years, which are going to help reduce CO2 production. Next slide, please. Again, it was sort of touched on briefly, but ammonia, this is now LPG being a transition fuel. Ammonia is more of a destination fuel. And there are clearly a number of benefits here. The table on the top explains that. The first clear one is that it's carbon free. So it's a fuel that we all want to consider. You know, and there's big discussions in the industry just now about how do we, if hydrogen is the end goal, how do we transport hydrogen efficiently? You know, and Neil mentioned that as well. Ammonia is already transported globally via ships, so it makes a lot of sense to be a good medium to transport hydrogen if that is the end product. A couple of advantages: there's carbon free. It can be produced from renewables, so it's the well to wake CO2 production can be carefully managed and be effectively zero. And yeah, it can be easily stored and transported, as I was mentioning there. But there are a number of challenges that need to be addressed, and that's we need to focus on those infrastructure challenges as well as the need for actual engines to develop that. Last slide, or penultimate slide. Future developments for us. Again, I'm conscious of time. That we are looking at other technologies to help improve the situation for CO2 production. Remote monitoring, as I mentioned. Retrofitting eco-smarts. Let's look at the LNG infrastructure just now. There are things we have to do to really improve the performance of the fleet, rather than just accepting we're going to build new ships all the time. Let's improve the performance by retrofitting. That's something we have to consider. And larger eco-smarts to allow larger ships to be built, the larger oil and gas management. That's not our first look at. And the final slide, my conclusion here, I'll just really dive to it. You know, it's imperative that we develop the most efficient method to transport gas globally, and that's what Babcock LGE are really focused on. And you know, to begin developing new technologies, we start with the implementation of testing fuel as soon as possible, and this will need engagement across all sectors. And you've talked about them today, from regulators, charterers to equipment manufacturers, and then indeed, as Ben was saying, governments too. Sorry, I've rattled through that and conscious of the time. If you have any questions, I'll take them at the end, of course.
Thanks very much, Graeme, and thanks for keeping to time there. We are running about 10 minutes behind, but we could extend a little bit towards the end just to make sure that we get plenty of questions in for the Q&A. If I just remind you, the Q&A session will be after the next speaker, so please do submit your questions now. Our next speaker is Richard Westgarth, who will be talking about MarRI-UK, who they are, and especially their flagship project on net zero coastal highways. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you. Can you just check you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Excellent, thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name's Richard Westgarth. I'm actually standing in today for Professor Alex Duffy, who's Director of MarRI-UK. I work for BMT, but I chair the working group that supports MarRI-UK. Next slide, please. So MarRI-UK is a collaborative partnership with industry, academia and government with a focus on innovation and technology for the sector. So we're looking really to bring together research innovation from across the sector, which has got a very widespread geography, focusing really on those mid-TRLs, that sort of bridging that research product gap. I'm trying to build on existing organization skills and capabilities. It's a tiered membership system. There's a list of members there. And we're also partnered with Maritime UK, so Ben, who's on this today, and also Society of Maritime Industry. Our priorities really have been driven by industry requirements, so around autonomy, autonomous systems, clean maritime, obviously the focus for today, but also considering design build aspects, support cost reduction aspects. And we're also very conscious of two cross-cutting themes, the data and decision support, but also sort of some of the more socio-technical interactions. You know, it's an industry based on people, and we're very conscious of the need to bridge those gaps as well. Next slide, please. So we've run two funded calls, both funded by Department for Transport, one on clean maritime, one on technology and innovation. So altogether we have 21 projects underway, but I should say that both these calls were well oversubscribed. And so we've been having discussions with DFT to try and basically create more funding opportunities, which we'll come on to. Next slide, please. What are we doing at the moment? Well, we're working through the clusters such as the Scottish Maritime Cluster, but also others, plus our academic partners to try and establish nodes, regional activity, provide that coordination. We're developing research roadmaps driven by the future requirements that industry particularly want, and obviously looking to sustain longer term funding. So we have submitted a CSR flagship proposal, which I'll come on to in a minute. So we're currently managing the projects that we've got underway. We've also just in the process of completing a smart shipping technology market research exercise. We're getting the first feedback on that over the next couple of weeks, and hopefully we'll be able to send that out much more broadly once that's done. And we're just in the process now of finalising another MARIT call, Smart Maritime Land Operations call, with again a further £1.35 million worth of funding on a matched basis with industry. Next slide, please. So this is really the main focus today. Ben highlighted the CSR requests that Maritime UK have made. So MarRI-UK also put in for a flagship proposal around a zero carbon coastal highway. So next slide, please. Ben's covered this, so I think we can skip through these. You've seen these figures, but it's an important sector for the UK. And we think that coastal shipping offers a great opportunity to build on the sector and to really position our growth agenda around a future transport perspective. Next slide, please. The market for green technologies, as Ben's already highlighted, is very large. The technology market related to smart shipping, advanced shipping is also growing rapidly. The estimate there is huge. If you think about it, 226 billion by 2030. Ben's covered the value of this UK shipping technology sector to the UK. But there's also the part that perhaps we haven't covered so well in the past, but smart shipping and autonomy will help, we believe, save a significant proportion of operating costs for the sector. Next slide, please. So what this program is about really is it's a modal transformational shift, if you like, from reliance on heavy road vehicles, heavy goods vehicles on the strategic roads network to move stuff from our major ports through the UK. There's a recognised problem with the high levels of emissions from heavy goods vehicles, the congested state of the strategic roads network, the impact on health and well-being of local populations, and also now, as we're starting to see, a need to think about how can we enhance the UK resilience to major incidents, strategic shocks in terminology such as COVID. Next slide, please. So the proposal we put in is to basically look at trying to move largely freight from the congested road network through to a coastal highway using clean technologies, digitally enabled solutions, linking together the existing coastal infrastructure. There are a large number of ports around the UK, estimates vary, but several hundred, that we believe we can link up and use them to build a new logistics system around the coastline of the UK, where we don't have to build new roads, we don't have to build new railways, and we can just focus much more then on delivering a better service through that thing. So we've set ourselves an effort to move forward 25% of the UK's land haulage in tonnes per kilometre by 2030 onto this system. And we've asked for a partnership investment from government of about £530 million over 10 years. That is a significant amount of money. It's not just about building the ships, it's about regeneration of ports, building the digital structures that we need to deliver this, and also the smart technologies that would operate and support this. Next slide, please. We see it as operating over two phases. One is if you like, a demonstrator phase to design, construct, and demonstrate a zero carbon short seas freighter. That's part one. And then the second phase is to start to expand on that solution by looking at transformation of the major and regional smaller ports, building more ships, and starting to deploy this in anger. So if you like, between now and 2030, starting to really make an impact on delivering this coastal highway solution. Next slide, please. So what do we think the impact of this would be? 39,000 jobs, 1.8 billion of revenue, significant reductions in emissions and congestion on the road networks. But there are added benefits. It's about regenerating some of the regional UK coastal communities, obviously zero carbon. There is an export market for these types of solutions. There's great interest around the world now in coastal shipping as a way of dealing with congestion in a number of countries. It offers opportunities to enhance port infrastructure. For those who are familiar with the National Shipbuilding Strategy, there's an opportunity here as well to improve British shipbuilding productivity and competitiveness. We're also very conscious of the need to think about safety, regulation, and legislation. So that's also a theme of this particular opportunity. Thank you. Next slide. I also mentioned that we're about to launch a call on smart maritime land operations. I'd like to just briefly familiarise you with that. The call will be going live, we hope, reasonably soon. Say it's worth about 1.35 million for match funding. And so the scope of the call, if you go to the next slide, really is to look for a single collaborative programme supporting automation, measurement, development of clean technologies in our ports, docksides and harbours. We're happy to cover commercial and naval ships, and we have been talking to the Royal Navy about joint working on this. But it's not just about the ports, it's about that interaction between the land and the shipping sector. So there's a real focus here on regional development, linking with innovation hubs, supporting infrastructure development, and we hope to consolidate some of the clean maritime core projects that we've seen through both our expressions of interest and the ones we've selected to move this forward, looking at more about the land operations side of the clean maritime agenda. Thank you. Next slide. So where are we at the moment? Some of you will have helped. We had some discussions early on with the cluster, and we've had other discussions with the regional clusters as well to look at the concept and look at what industry and operators see as the challenges and priorities they'd like addressing. We've developed that into a project scope that we will hopefully come out very shortly to start to ask for expressions of interest. The scope's currently with DFT for their approval. So we are reasonably close, we think, to being able to launch that. And the idea then is from expressions of interest, we will then go and run a more detailed competition on selected projects with a view of starting to award contracts around the sort of end of first quarter 2021. And then we'll obviously move into the delivery phase and evaluation, demonstration, communication. The competition will be announced through MarRI-UK website. Details I'll give you at the end, and through the normal social media channels. Next slide, please. So in terms of, sorry, these aren't my slides. In terms of participation, we're happy for people to get in touch with MarRI-UK. We are inclusive, we're open for all. The membership's on a tiered basis, so hopefully we can find a membership level that would suit the size, scale and ambitions of your organisations. We are looking very much to support regional growth and collaborate and build collaboration across the regions, and basically looking at funding, creating future funding opportunities such as the Smart Maritime Land Operations, and you can follow us through the normal channels. Next slide. I'll just really, before I give you the details of how you can get involved, I'll leave you with a quote from John Howie, who's Chief Executive Marine at Babcock, that he's highlighted in support of what we're trying to do through the Zero Carbon Coastal Highway. I think the key thing there is it's about collaboration. It's about joining forces to deliver a future trading opportunities, about developing the technologies that position the UK as a world leader. So that's there. So I've rattled through very quickly. I'll just leave you the next slide, which has got contact points. If you have any questions, please go direct to those, or please feel free to contact me directly. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. Some great initiatives happening at MarRI-UK, and perhaps I could suggest a future workshop to share some of the detail of these projects with a wider maritime community, which is something that the Scottish Maritime Cluster would be delighted to arrange and support. Now that concludes today's speakers. If you've thoughts and suggestions on anything that you have heard today, I welcome all feedback for future workshops. If you just use the email addresses brian.fulton at scottishmaritimecluster.com or duncan.cunningham@scottishmaritimecluster.com. We're going to run a quick poll just now to see what people's thoughts are on that. And I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Duncan Cunningham, who's going to run the Q&A session. We are running a bit behind time, but we could run a little bit over for that. Over to you, Duncan.
Thank you. I've got a number of questions in, and I'll combine them together to make it perhaps a bit easier and save some time. But the first three questions came in when Kevin and Declan were speaking. And so if you don't mind, I'll just put them together, and perhaps between Kevin and Declan, you could answer them. The first one is a purely technical one, is what is the battery capacity of the Hallaig installation? And the second one is, from CMAL's experiences from several years of operation of the three existing hybrid vessels, what would you take forward for the future replacement, specifically the Loch class? And the final part of that came in, was, have you ever given any thought to powering with ammonia?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to answer there. For the Hallaig and the Loch-and-Var, the first two, we have two battery packs forward and aft at 375 kilowatt hours. So that's a total of 750 kilowatt hours. And on the Katrina, the newest one, we managed to get up to 800 kilowatt hours. The second one from Lindsay, yeah, we've had really positive experiences with the hybrids. Noise, vibration, everything's been great. I can remember when I was doing my dissertation, I saw the crew running around turning off lights that didn't need to be on just to see if they could get those emissions and fuel consumption down even further, which was really great to see them buying into it. For going forward to new vessels, I think the key is to make sure we get the weight down as much as possible to try and get as many batteries on the vessels as possible to see if we can fully electrify the vessels. And the last one on ammonia, CMAL haven't directly looked at it yet, but we are very aware of the potential, and we're engaged with a lot of the big engine manufacturers, and they're keeping us updated with developments.
And Ben, I know that you had a thought on ammonia as well. Could you share that with the rest of the audience, please?
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, it was just to say that if we can send it round, or we'll send it via the cluster if people haven't already seen it. But if you look at the Clean Maritime Plan that DFT published last July, so 2 Julys ago now, it showed that, or it suggested that ammonia was one of the most likely viable alternative fuels. So, and I know there's then been subsequent questions since there's been a UK government focus on hydrogen. How do the two work together? But people who know more about these things than I can have explained about the link between how ammonia can be got from hydrogen. But what I can say is the Clean Maritime Council hasn't met for a little while, but it's due to, and I know there is quite a bit of discussion around the extent to which we sort of pick winners, and clearly from a market approach, that's not something the UK has ever really done. It's a much easier kind of dynamic in something like automotive, where you've got fewer potential options. But in maritime, everybody recognises that, you know, if you're looking at something like offshore support vessels, crew transfer vessels, it's probably a very different solution to deep sea movement. So it's in there, it's in the Clean Maritime Plan, and I think it's fair to say when the Clean Maritime Plan was published, it was the #1 alternative fuel that was suggested. One thing to add here is we'll be working with Brian and Duncan and all of you in terms of developing a cluster development plan. And that feeds in very well to the work that DFT is doing in terms of innovation hubs. And our aspiration certainly is to find specialism across the UK, so that we don't just have different parts of the UK working on the same technology. Where there's an opportunity to collaborate and achieve more than on our own, then great. But equally, if we, and MarRI-UK has helped to do this by the different teams that have been awarded funding, we can create something, so USPs for different parts of the country and different solutions that respond perhaps to the needs of the companies that are in the area. And I know that's very much what was intended with the Clean Maritime Plan and the Clean Maritime clusters within that. Then I think that's something that the Scottish cluster should think very carefully about. And it might be that, given Scotland's size, that there's a number of different hubs within Scotland responding to these. You've obviously got what colleagues at the EMEC are doing, but I think that's something to really think about over the next coming months.
Okay, thank you. Matthias van Herp, I suppose this question came in when Richard was speaking, so I think that's directed toward him. Given that we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, have you any thoughts on nuclear power for ship marine propulsion?
I think the challenges we've had are nuclear power is not acceptable to a lot of nations around the world. And so you've got a very limited opportunity to build these sort of the nuclear power solutions. You know, you can't whilst the UK has a nuclear power industry, we have obviously a nuclear submarine industry. The application of it, I think, at the moment would not really create an international market. So when you're thinking about nuclear, you've got to think internationally rather than just about the UK itself.
Okay. Brithy, I think you really asked the question specifically with to Richard. Could you get in touch with him about looking for carrying forward your business? It's not really a question for the panel, I don't think, but we'll certainly help you make that introduction. Claire, if the R&D from the maritime sector is being undertaken with partnership with other sectors such as waste and recycling and the safety sector to assure there's no unintended consequences, such as what can be done about the waste materials of batteries, etc., from shipping?
Okay, that's I've got to be totally honest, it's quite a hard question. The sectors that are dealing with, for example, waste from batteries are largely going to be driven by those early adopters, which, if you like, is the automotive sector. And I know that there are schemes in place through automotive for recycling of batteries, reuse of batteries. and indeed follow-on applications of batteries that are declining and are no longer appropriate for the automotive sector. Within MarRI-UK, we are talking with some of the Industrial Strategy Challenge funds and the catapults about some of these things. I think one area that started to interest me is the idea of low carbon shipbuilding. We talk about low carbon in terms of zero carbon in terms of operations and freight and transport and shipping. We don't talk about reducing carbon in actually the product development manufacturing part of the industry. And maybe that's an area where some more focus could be usefully applied.
Thank you. There's one question I'm going to put to all the panelists, just to give a very brief answer. Where do you think we should be, if you had one priority going forward, what would it be? Could you put the panelists up on my screen, Dawn, and I could actually go through them all? Well, Richard, if you could answer that one. Sorry, you seem to be.
That's okay. Not. I personally think the challenge isn't in a particular solution. I think what we've got is an international challenge of competing standards as we develop the zero carbon solutions. Because it's not just about, as we've heard from others, it's not just about the zero carbon bit of the ship. It's about the zero carbon infrastructure we need to support those things. And it's about how do we bring that together as a maritime sector as a whole and create a sort of what I would call as an engineer, a systems perspective on that, so that we're developing that and starting to lead the international debate rather than follow it.
Graeme, have you any further thoughts?
Yeah, that's me. I think collaboration, if I'm honest with you. I mean, I touched on what Richard's saying there. There's so many areas, so many different sectors, government, regulatory bodies, to system manufacturers, to ships, to infrastructure, to transport. You know, it's too big for one single group even, or specialist to look at. It's a bigger picture than that. So I think wider scale, and then, you know, to touch on what Richard said earlier on, is we need to focus on shipbuilding for sure, but there's also an aspect bigger than that. You think of other ways to keep the fleet operating more efficiently, in which case we don't have to build new ships. You know, the question's much bigger, and I agree. I think we need to drive that. We drive the collaborative and drive the change rather than wait for, you know, mandated from IMOs or whoever else. We need to drive it because otherwise we'll be too far behind the curve before we need to act.
Okay. Neil, have you any further thoughts? No. Okay. Kevin,
sorry, Duncan. Neil has had to leave us, but sends his apologies.
Okay. Kevin, have you had any? Would like to add anything to that before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it's really looking at the whole infrastructure piece, and I'm not talking about the design of ferries or ports here, but actually getting energy to ports. So it's really, I think, a national grid effort, really. One of the things which we angst about, I would suggest, is whether power is actually at a port or whether it isn't. Now, fairly obviously, it's quite unique because in some ways, you know, the island chains that we go to, they certainly don't always have the required power, and getting it there can be very expensive. But I mean, if you look at the wider piece, even some of the major cities which have ports such as Southampton, Liverpool, Bristol, etc., you know, that there are some astronomical sums of money to get the grid, you know, up to, you know, the required specification for some of the larger vessels. And I suppose in a smaller scale, there's equal challenges, just when we look at how we're going to charge cars. You know, the actual infrastructure throughout the whole of the UK, if we're all heading towards the green energy solution, is going to be quite challenging, you know, throughout. So I think there needs to be a real focus on that. Certainly, people involved in technology would be able to, you know, to come up with the solutions for whether it's ships or smarter ports or cars or trains or lorries, but actually, you know, the charging infrastructure for electrification is going to be very, very expensive, I would suggest, and needs to be looked at very carefully.
Well, I think that's really wraps up this morning. First of all, just before we close, I hope you've all completed the poll, because we'd like to share it with you in the next few minutes, just before I stop speaking. Anyway, thank you all for attending today, and we hope you found the event worthwhile. And a particular thank you to Brody's, who actually helped all this technology work. I never thought a law firm would actually be quite so good technically, but thank you so much indeed, Don, or to Duncan and his team and Don in particular, for helping Brian and myself through this. A recording of today's event will be available for you to download, and we intend to hold future workshops in future. So we look forward to hearing from you, either through the doodle poll, which we'll send out, or to Brian and myself directly at the emails, which Brian has read out so well several times. And we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you.